And first of all, I want to thank Casey very much for being one of our first presenters, and I know he's got a busy year coming up, and so I really appreciate, and Savannah Institute appreciates the time that you're taking and that everybody here is taking to be with us and join for some information and some sharing. So, Casey, I'll let you introduce yourself and Feral Farm however you want to, and then you can go ahead and get started when you're ready.
All right, well, thank you, Christy. So, yeah, thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I kind of started on my own chestnut journey, getting interested in chestnuts, really coming from kind of the more J. Russell Smith kind of industrial tree crop idea as a way to solve a lot of the environmental issues with agriculture. And that was kind of my beginning, and things have definitely evolved for me since then, where I guess before I was thinking more of like kind of an extensive farm kind of thing, and now I'm kind of viewing chestnuts more from a bit more of an intensive kind of orchard standpoint. So I think there's those are kind of two different ways of looking at it, and neither is necessarily wrong. A lot of it just depends on what your actual objectives and kind of farm plan are. So my farm, Feral Farm, is 10 acres, and I started out with kind of more diversity, but the chestnuts have really proved themselves just as far as their adaptability to my site, and so they're growing really excellently. They're cheaper to establish per acre than something that's much more dense, like high-density apples, for example, or even hazelnuts, just because there's fewer plants per acre, and it's easier to protect them from deer, which is a big issue on my farm. So I'm actually removing hazelnut bushes that I planted to replace them with chestnuts. And just more and more that I look into chestnuts, I'm really impressed and hopeful, and I think they offer a lot of economic opportunities. So that being said, I started my planting in 2014, so it's 4 years old this year, actually this spring. So, this is not something that I've been doing for a long time, and I'm a veteran grower, and I'm, hauling pallet bins of chestnuts to market or anything like that. I was really humbled by being asked to do this. I don't really consider myself an expert, but one thing that I have done is I've needed to listen to the different chestnut experts and find out what I believe, because not every chestnut expert believes the same thing, and they often have very strong opinions and sometimes don't get along either. So I've spent a lot of time just wrapping my head around what are the different ideas out there, what is going to work for me, and the most helpful thing that I've found is just talking to growers that are actually doing it. There's a lot you can learn from university publications and things like that, but really the best information I found is just talking to chestnut growers. So I'm hoping to present a fairly unbiased look at just what people are planting as far as chestnuts, mostly in the eastern U.S., but I'll kind of touch on the whole country a little bit, and I'll kind of make it known when it's my opinion, I guess. And one quick apology too is I am coming down with a cold, so if I sound kind of stuffy and I, sneeze or anything like that, just sorry about that. And luckily we're doing this over the internet, so you can't catch anything. So, all right, so let's delve into it. The presentation was titled Chestnut Genetics, but we're not really going to be talking about like genetics on like a genomic level. I guess it's more referring to germplasm, like what is out there as far as cultivars and varieties, more so. So I've met a lot of people that, for whatever reason, they hear about chestnuts, kind of like when I started out, and they think this is a solution to something, and they get excited. But a lot of times, they don't really know where to go from there. It's just like, I want to grow chestnuts. And some people just planting chestnuts is enough. That's where they end. They plant them and they say, all right, I did it. And that's not really the end point. The planting is just the beginning. I also see a lot of people have kind of ideas about what they're going to do without really looking into it very deeply. For example, I've met people that are really excited about chestnuts, and they are going to start a chestnut orchard, and they want to plant American chestnuts. And they don't really know that there's more than one species of chestnuts, and that American chestnuts are not really grown for a reason, which we'll get into soon. So I think I would like to see, people look more at the details than just, I want to grow chestnuts. Just really look into the specifics, which is what we're going to do here. So there are kind of 4 major species of chestnuts that are used in commerce around the world. Well, not the American chestnut, but that's important in America just from our kind of historical standpoint. So there's the American chestnut, European chestnut, Japanese chestnut, and Chinese chestnut. And there's a number of other species, and some of which are found in hybrids, but they're kind of generally not as prominent or as important. So those are things like the American chinkapin, sanguine, and the Henry chestnut in China. So first, the American chestnut, Chestnut dentata, is our native U.S. chestnut. It was a large timber tree, and most people know the story about it being infected by chestnut blight, which came from China, and for all intents and purposes, really wiped out the species, at least from a population standpoint. And so it was an amazing tree, just as far as its size and its ecological importance. But I think we need to not let the kind of romanticism around it cloud our judgment too much. Like I was saying before, you don't want to plant American chestnuts in the East because they will eventually get blight and die. Even if you're in an area where there isn't blight, it's kind of just a matter of time before it finds its way. There's a number of isolated stands of American chestnut that have eventually gotten blight. Another thing that people often don't talk about is that the chestnuts that American chestnut produces are very small, and they're just really not something that most consumers would be interested in. And another downside of that is they dry out extremely fast. So generally people are wanting to harvest daily their chestnuts, keep the quality good, keep them from drying out. But the smaller the nut is, the faster it dries out, and it just loses quality much faster. And the whole reason that people started importing non-native species of chestnuts into America was mainly the nut size. They wanted larger nuts like were found in Europe. So for all the species, I'm going to kind of go through this because I think all of the species kind of do offer something when it comes to hybrids, and it's good to know if you're working with a hybrid, some of the characteristics that a specific species could offer it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will have that characteristic, but it's good to know that there's a possibility there. So the things that American chestnuts offer, they have a high fat content in the nuts, which is actually, I think, one of its biggest benefits. Most of the other species have much lower fat content, but the higher fat just kind of has a nicer mouthfeel. And I think what a lot of people experience when they say that American chestnuts are the sweetest, I think actually the fat content is part of that. They're, sensing this flavor that they like, but they just kind of say, oh, it's sweeter. Also, it's the most cold-hardy species, depending on where the specific chestnut is coming from. Chestnuts were native all throughout the growing zones in the east, so it's entirely possible that an American chestnut used in a cross that was from the south will not be hardy in the north. That being said, there are a number of American chestnuts in more northern areas that are quite cold hardy in, say, zone 4. It also has more of an upright timber form, which is nice if that's something you're interested in. And also, its ability to create pollen sterile lines, I think, is also a really interesting thing, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The next species is the European chestnut, Chestnut sativa, and it's the first one that people tried to grow, which makes sense because the early immigrants to the country were European, but often has poor winter hardiness, especially if it's from warmer areas of Europe. It has a larger nut, but it often has a thick pellicle, and the pellicle is just the skin that's around the nut between the shell and the actual nut meat. And on some species, it's quite thin, almost more like the papery husk around a peanut. And then on others, like European chestnut, it can be very thick and also cling to the nut meat because there's a lot of kind of like ridges and stuff that it can get deeper into the actual nut meat. Not all European chestnuts have that. There's a number of cultivars, hundreds of cultivars in Europe, and many of them have been selected for having a better peeling characteristic. And it's also blight susceptible. So for breeding purposes, it does have a large nut, and it is high quality from good cultivars, and it is also a larger, more timber form kind of tree. And then also there's kind of a certain amount of marketability to it in that it is from Europe, so there's kind of more Eurocentric cuisines that might be kind of more interesting to them, but that's probably not that important. The next species that was imported into America is the Japanese chestnut, Chestnut Genetics. And that started being brought into the U.S. In the 1870s, and it drew a lot of interest because it has a very large nut. And like the European, it can have a very thick, kind of convoluted pellicle that makes it hard to peel. They tend to have more of a starchier nut than other species. And one characteristic of a lot of Japanese chestnut is when they first start bearing, the nuts are often smaller, and as the tree gets larger, the nuts kind of get larger with age. And that's kind of frustrating because you don't really know what the tree is going to produce until it's older. And it is not as cold hardy as Chinese chestnut. So for kind of breeding purposes, it is tolerant of both blight and phytophthora, which is a root rot. It's often called ink disease, and it's not, the Japanese chestnut is not as tolerant or resistant to blight as Chinese chestnut is, but definitely more so than European and American. Again, it has a large nut, and it also, a number of the Japanese chestnuts show resistance to Asian chestnut gall wasp, and that is a pest that's still spreading throughout the East. I think in the last 4 years or so, it's entered into Michigan. It's in most of the Southeast, and that affects the new growth. It's a wasp that lays an egg inside the buds, and when those buds grow in the spring, they form a gall, which disrupts the growth of the tree and lowers the yield. And it's really bad. At least I've heard that it can kill trees. So Japanese chestnut, some of them show resistance to the gall wasp, but in some studies in Japan, they actually had a breeding program to breed chestnuts resistant to gall wasp, and it was found that eventually they just evolved to get around whatever resistance that was, and they found it is actually much more effective to institute biological controls of introducing parasitoid that attacks the gall wasp. And that's what's happening in a number of areas where the gall wasp was first introduced. Another really big benefit, I think, probably one of the more meaningful ones from Japanese chestnut is it tends to mature nuts earlier, so it does better in shorter season climates and ones with not as many heat units. So I think that's a really big benefit for northern areas, especially ones that stay cool for a lot of the summer. And then finally to Chinese chestnut, Castanea mollissima. So interest grew when the blight was kind of first happening, and it wasn't necessarily because of the blight. People were starting to grow Chinese chestnut a little bit right when the blight happened, and then of course the interest grew much more so once people realized that the Chinese chestnut was probably the most resistant. A lot of people thought they could just plant Chinese chestnut out in the woods and have it replace American chestnuts, but it's just a very different species. It doesn't compete as well for the most part in the eastern woodlands. But people are also looking at using it to breed blight resistance in American chestnuts. And the most well-known example of that is the American Chestnut Foundation. The nuts on Chinese chestnut, they can be small, and actually, all of these species, they can produce trees with small nuts. But depending on the specific kind of genetics of Chinese chestnuts, even commercial ones in China can be of a smaller size to quite a large size. The opposite issue happens with Chinese chestnut in that when they first start bearing, the nuts are often large, and as it starts producing more, the nut size decreases with age. So it's kind of the opposite problem of the Japanese chestnut in that you might have a tree that produces large nuts, you're really excited, but maybe by the time it's 10 or 15 years old, the nuts are drastically diminished in size. Another big issue with Chinese chestnuts is delayed grafting compatibility, and that's just you plant a grafted tree, it's growing great, it's yielding, and it could be 10 years from when you plant it, and it'll just break off clean at the graft union. And there's a lot of different theories about why that happens, but no one's exactly sure why and what can be done about it. It's one of the big hindrances to growing grafted Chinese chestnuts. And also in warmer areas, Chinese chestnut has a reputation of certain cultivars producing secondary flowers later in the season that can kind of decrease the energy that can go into ripening the first crop of nuts. For breeding purposes, it has a really great quality nut, thin pellicle, and sweet flavor. It has both blight resistance and phytophthora resistance, and it's much more hardy than most of the other species besides American. And again, the same caveat with the American chestnut is that it kind of depends on the specific genetics of what you're planting, but within the genetics of Chinese chestnut, there is quite cold hardy genes there. So, what are people planting? Broadly, I would say that there's two categories of chestnuts that most people are planting, and I repeat it in general broadly because there's a lot of different possibilities as far as germplasm for what you can plant with chestnuts, but I think it's helpful to just think of two categories, and it's really what I've noticed kind of divides the chestnut world, and that is hybrid cultivars of European and Japanese chestnut, or Chinese chestnut and hybrids that are fairly similar to Chinese chestnut. And for the Chinese chestnut and hybrids, people are growing both grafted cultivars and seedlings. For the most part, people that are growing the European-Japanese hybrids, they're growing specifically grafted cultivars. So the European-Japanese hybrids, they're grown mostly in California and the Pacific Northwest, and Michigan is kind of an outlier. For the most part, most people in the East are planting more of the Chinese chestnuts or hybrids of various lineages that are similar. But Michigan, a number of years back, decided that they wanted to attempt to grow the European-Japanese hybrid for a number of reasons, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But European-Japanese hybrids, they do really well in California and specifically the Pacific Northwest, because the Pacific Northwest is quite warm because of the ocean, but if you look at a map, it's pretty far north. So it's a shorter season, and because of the cooling effects of the ocean as well, it just doesn't get very warm. And so these hybrids tend to do better there in a cooler environment, and they're able to ripen their nuts within their shorter season. So these hybrids are often very productive and have large nuts. One of the characteristics that people like about them is they start producing high yields fairly quickly, and they reach their yield potential faster, which means, you know, an individual tree might produce, let's just say, 60 pounds of nuts. European Japanese hybrid might get to that kind of yield potential much quicker than say a Chinese chestnut, which might take, you know, up to maybe 15 years to reach its yield potential. One of the downsides of them, like both its parents, it can have a thick and convoluted pellicle, so it doesn't heal very well. Another downside is that they're blight susceptible. They're probably more resistant than a pure European, but they're definitely not as resistant as the Chinese. They're not particularly cold hardy, but again, they're being grown in Michigan. A lot of people have said when Michigan first started growing these that, you know, it's going to be a disaster and they're all going to die in a cold winter, but you know, there are still farms growing them that have gone through, you know, the polar vortex. So I think it's often a question not so much of the entire orchard dying, but probably more so of damage to branches and having more sight from that cold damage for letting in things like light. I think that's probably more of an issue of the cold than just outright killing the tree, unless you're in the colder parts of Zone 5 or Zone 4. So the way a lot of people grow these hybrids is they'll often have pretty much pure blocks of just single cultivars with pollinizer trees spread throughout. So like most nut trees, chestnuts are not self-pollinating, so they need a tree that's unrelated, that's flowering at the same time to produce nuts. So the way that the European Japanese hybrids is often done is just having pollinators strategically placed around the orchard. And most of the cultivars are either pollen sterile or just don't produce a whole lot of pollen. So there are specific pollinizers that are just very much geared towards pollen production that are used for that. Some of the cultivars, Colossal is a fairly well-known one that was grown out in California and then was brought to Michigan. This is a very contentious variety or cultivar that a lot of people think of it as the red delicious of chestnuts, in that it's often a quite large nut, but it's fairly low quality as far as its flavor, and it doesn't really peel well. It has a very thick pellicle and a lot of kind of convoluted areas where the pellicle gets in quite deep into the nut. The reason that people grow it is that it is very productive. It produces a lot of nuts, and just from a farm perspective, you know, that's a good thing. But almost every chestnut grower that I talk to that isn't growing Colossal generally has nothing good to say about them. And I would say that even in like Michigan, for example, where colossals have been grown, they are kind of pushing people more to some of these other varieties. So I don't speak French, so I don't know how well I'll pronounce these, but you can see here there's Bouche de Bédézac, and well, you can read them for yourself. I won't butcher them. But the last three, the Maraval, Marisol, and Marigold, those are really interesting because they were developed in Europe, and they all respond pretty well to being propagated on their own roots by either cuttings or kind of more of like a micro-propagation, lab-grown plantlets. So those can be produced on their own roots, and they're actually developed to use as rootstock. So I think they're kind of interesting from that standpoint, because there really isn't any clonal rootstock for chestnuts. So that could offer some more uniformity for orchards. So all of these varieties tend to have quite large nuts. They tend to have, again, a thicker pellicle than a lot of, say, a Chinese chestnut, but they are very productive and large nuts, so they're popular for that reason. Chinese and similar hybrids, I won't go through all of these necessarily, but there are pure Chinese cultivars, and Qing, which is the first one, it's pronounced Qing, is noteworthy in that it's very productive, and it produces a very sweet nut. And all of these listed are kind of favored by University of Missouri and a number of other growers as grafted cultivars, and also as seed sources for growing out seedlings. And we'll get to the whole grafted versus seed in a little bit. But there are also a number of hybrids that people that grow Chinese are often also growing some of these, not necessarily all of them. Louval's Monster, the first one, not a lot of people grow that as a grafted cultivar because the nuts tend to split in quite high numbers, so the nut needs to almost get too big for the shell, and they'll split open, and that's generally frowned upon. But I think it offers a lot of possibility for growing up seedlings and evaluating them because it is quite productive. It has genes for large nuts, like why it's called a monster. But it also is pollen sterile, and all of its seedlings are pollen sterile because it's not pollen sterile because of a genetic thing that can be, say, dominant or recessive and passed on to some offspring and not others, or dependent on what it's pollinized by. It produces pollen sterile offspring because of kind of a genetic abnormality in its cross with an American chestnut. So I think that offers a lot of possibility for growing pollen sterile lines that are potentially very productive, because a lot of the energy that the tree is putting out is going into the male flowers. And so this could be a situation where you could grow an entire row of pollen sterile trees and have rows on either side that are going to be pollinating it. So I think it's a pretty exciting cultivar for seedling crosses and growing out seedlings. And then some of these others, Sleeping Giant, Eaton, Lockwood, they all, like Newell's Monster, have American genetics in, so it's thought that they are more cold hardy. Newell's Monster certainly is, and Sleeping Giant seems to be more cold hardy than the average Chinese. I'm going to be growing Lockwood, and so we'll see. Another hybrid is Sago, and that one's a little different in that it has Chinkapin genetics, possibly European as well, and American. It's not 100% known, but it produces very nice nuts, and it's reputed to graft quite easily and not have as many issues with delayed grafting compatibility. And it also apparently produces pretty nice seedlings on average. And then just some other kind of lines of note. You'll often hear about Dunstan chestnuts, and those are Chinese crossed with American. Most people that are growing them are growing seedlings, but there are some cultivars that were released a while back that are around, and those are, there's Revival, Willamette, there's a number of others, but those two are probably the most common that I've seen. But for the most part, people growing Dunstans are growing seedlings. And from talking with growers and people that have tried to grow them in more kind of zone 5 areas, they don't tend to do as well. They don't really have the cold hardiness and the adaptation to colder zones. So that being said, there are people in cooler areas. This strain was developed in Florida, so there are a number of people in cooler areas that have grown out a lot of seedlings and started orchards. So if you are really interested in Dunstans, it might be good to search out some of those places if you're in a colder zone. Then there's Gelatly from British Columbia. And he was growing what he claimed were Chinese chestnuts. Some people have theorized that they're Chinese European. Others think they might have more American or Japanese in them. So it's not exactly known what their exact lineage is, but for the most part, they all end in like Oka or some of these other kind of endings. So like Layeroka, Skyoka, Skookum. Those are the Gelatly varieties. I included them in here because they are they're actually quite hardy. I know some people in Zone 4 that are growing seedlings of Layeroka, and I think that's worth noting because in Zone 4 there's just not really a lot of options for chestnuts. It's not really a commercial area at this point, but I think there could be potential for it. There's a chestnut grower up in Ontario named Ernie Grimo, and he has some Gelatly descended varieties, so like Grimo 140, 142Q. So there has been some improvements on his material throughout time. And then there is Badger Set complex hybrids. So these were bred by Badger Set in Minnesota, and they are in Zone 4, and they are kind of a mix of a lot of different species, and what you get as far as what's going to be expressed in the seedlings is fairly variable. They seem to have a fair amount of American chestnut in them, and that they're quite large and vigorous trees in general. So I think there's there's potential in the Badger Set hybrids, but they have a reputation of producing quite small nuts, and even Badger Set themselves, they recommend a very, very high planting density. I think they recommend 18 inches apart, with thinning to a wider spacing eventually, just to kind of cull interior trees. And that's just that's a lot to ask of someone, I think. So I think if you're in Zone 4, they're definitely worth planting, because there's not a lot of other Zone 4 chestnuts, and potentially in parts of Zone 5. But there's also Red Currant Farm. They grew out a number of Badger Set trees and kind of selected some that had larger nuts that they crossed with good Chinese chestnut cultivars. And so I think they're also a good try for into Zone 4. So, what should you plant? Before you decide what specific varieties or cultivars, you need to decide, are you going to be doing seedlings or grafted trees? And this is another really big contentious debate within the chestnut world. Most, I guess what I would call university expert people, really push for grafted trees, because that is what every other tree-based orchard industry uses. Apples, peaches, plums, everything is grafted cultivars. There's very few seedling orchards out there. So the assumption is, well, chestnuts are just like all those other fruits, so you need to grow grafted trees. And then a number of other people say that seedlings are viable. So a cultivar, I've referred to that a number of times. If you're not familiar, it is a cultivated variety. It's a named clone. So it's like a Macintosh apple. Every Macintosh tree is a clone of the original Macintosh tree. There's just one tree that people took scion wood of and grafted it and made all of the Macintosh that have ever lived. So the advantages of growing a grafted cultivar is a more uniform yield, performance, disease resistance, and ripening time. That's in theory. In talking with a number of chestnut growers, they've told me that there's still a lot of variability within grafted trees. Probably partially because mostly people are growing on seedling rootstocks, so that could have an effect. But also, chestnuts are just a little different. So what a lot of people think is like, okay, I'll grow this one variety in this block, and it ripens first, so it'll drop all of its nuts, and then the next block will ripen after that. But a lot of times, the grafted trees will not be in sync. So it's quite strange. Another advantage is that they'll start producing larger yields quicker. Again, that's in theory. It depends on where you're growing to a certain degree. If you're in a colder area, that might not be the case. So the disadvantages is grafted trees cost more. If you're buying nursery stock, it's going to cost more, or if you're planting seedlings that you're going to top work, it costs more in time. And then delayed grafting compatibility is a issue in Chinese chestnuts, again, like I said, where it'll be doing fine for up to a decade, and then it'll just snap. Also, grafted trees seem like they have a lower vigor in more northern areas, so into like zone 5. And that might be just because the graft union is more tender tissue that's more easily damaged by the cold. And then, yes, the graft union can be more tender, so that the tree could be totally hardy, but in a really cold winter, the graft union will become damaged. So the advantage of seedlings is that they're cheaper plants, they're often more vigorous, and you don't have to worry about graft failure. The disadvantages are that you might have a tree or a number of trees that are just very poor producers. They might have a small size, or quality of nut might be very poor, and you don't really know that ahead of time until you're able to evaluate them. A seedling planting will ripen at different times. Again, that's in practice maybe not an issue. And then also you don't know about the disease resistance and hardiness. So this is where things get contentious with certain people is what a number of people argue for is that seedlings have an advantage, and that if you're going to be growing seedlings, that you should have seedlings from specific cultivars that you know are good. So you know that at least the female parent has good genetics. So you would take seed from a grafted chain tree, for example, throw out those seedlings for your stock. A lot of people are doing this. Some people think, again, it's crazy because, it's like playing the lottery. But that might not necessarily be the case. There's a number of orchards that are relying entirely on seedling chestnuts and are doing quite well, and a number of people have found that, especially with Chinese chestnuts, when you're growing seedlings, for the most part, if they're from good cultivars, that they will produce reasonably good offspring. So I would say that if you are going to buy seedlings, that's the way to go, and stay away from just generic Chinese chestnut. A lot of nurseries will buy the smallest seed they can, because you're generally buying seed by the pound, and if you have Chinese chestnut seed that is very small, you're getting more individuals per pound as a nursery, so you have more plants to sell. So I think a number of nurseries do that specifically to maximize their profits. So I would say focus on nurseries, if you're going to buy seedlings, that know the lineage of them. You can find out cultivar characteristics through variety trials, which is important both if you're going to be growing grafted trees or if you wanted seedlings from specific varieties. Another theory is that for grafting, if you grow a seedling of a cultivar and then graft that cultivar onto it, you have higher success rates. So again, growing a chain seedling you would graft it to Qing cyanwood and have higher levels of success. That's kind of anecdotal. I don't know if I've ever seen very thorough studies of that. I have seen some things say that they've had success doing that and also a lot of failures. So again, it's kind of not known. The European Japanese hybrids do not produce good offspring as readily as Chinese. So if you're going to be growing those, I would definitely go for grafted varieties, and there aren't many people growing seedlings of those. So I think there's some different strategies that can be used for growing seedlings where it's not like an extreme either or. You're either growing grafted or you're growing seedlings. So personally what I'm doing is I'm growing specific seedlings. So an example would be one row is all seedlings of the cultivar Gideon, and then the next row is a different cultivar. And then I'm going to evaluate those seedlings, and ones that are not good producers or just have characteristics I don't like, I can then graft those to the parent cultivar. And even if that tree does not produce as good as it could, it'll still produce better than the plant I'm culling, and it'll also give me more seeds of specific cultivars. Another option, if you're kind of wanting to hedge your bets, is you could alternate rows of grafted trees and seedling trees. A number of planting teams have you removing an entire row at some point, often about like 20 years, 25 years down the line. So you could alternate seedling and grafted rows just to give you some insurance of being able to evaluate some seedlings where you don't have to worry about grafting compatibility, and also having grafted cultivars where if you have that graft failure, you also have seedlings to kind of back it up. Again, this is all things that you need to weigh and decide who you believe to a certain extent, and where you want to place your risk, I guess. And then, of course, you need to decide, are you going to be growing Chinese trees, or are you going to be growing Japanese, European? Well, why not grow both? There is this idea of the internal kernel breakdown. So that happens in Japanese, European hybrids when they're pollinated by Chinese trees. And it's just a spoiling of the nut that is not really something you can see on the outside because it just comes from a incompatibility with the pollen. However, so this came out of Michigan. There was a study there showing that this was happening, but there are a number of people I've talked to who are growing both Chinese and the Japanese European hybrids, and they don't really have issues with internal kernel breakdown. So it is possible that there's also some sort of nutrient deficiency or something like that that's affecting this, or genetics of specific cultivars. Again, with the Chinese, delayed grafting compatibility is a problem. And then also, how cold do you get? What is your disease pressure? Are you on the West Coast where you don't have to worry about blight? Or are you in the Appalachians, and there's, you know, blighted American chestnuts all over the place, resprouting and continually getting blight, where you have a really high disease pressure in your area. That also needs to weigh on what you decide to plant. And then just getting into, I see this often on Facebook where someone will say, hey, I found this nut. And people will say, I want seed, I want to grow it. And they'll say, okay, yeah, here, I'm going to, send this all around. And that's great, but what do you know about the seed? What do you know about the nut? How does it compare to cultivars that are out there? So just some quick numbers. I know we're kind of getting pressed for time, so I'll just kind of go through this quick. If you're at a 20 by 20 spacing, each tree needs to produce about 20 pounds to get to your 2,000 pounds per acre often quoted number of what chestnuts produce. If you're at a 30 by 30 spacing, you need more, like 40 pounds per tree to get to that 2,000 pounds. I think 12 grams on average is a really good kind of beginning nut size. I would prefer larger than that, but in general, I think 12 grams is a good kind of cutoff on the low end. But it also kind of depends on your market. And that's a whole other thing with all these cultivars is how much is your market really wanting large chestnuts? How much are they wanting smaller chestnuts? And then other things to look for are good peeling, taste, and disease resistance and cold hardiness if you're in a cold area. So if you want to contact me, this is my email. You can follow me on Facebook. That is my farm page where I don't post nearly enough. But thank you all for coming. And I don't know if you still have time for some questions, Christy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Casey. And I know you put a lot into this, partially because, from what I understand, you probably planned more in planting than probably anybody else or most other farmers. So thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge that you gathered tonight. And I'll turn it over to the question and answer session right now. Matt, did you want to add anything or ask any questions of Casey right off the bat?
I'm good for now. I'll let other folks have a swing at him. It was great. Thank you, Casey.
Casey, when I was at your farm for the field day this summer, there were a couple on the ends of your fields that they had nice big chestnuts on them. They seem to be doing better than some of the other ones. Were those a specific cultivar? The trees seemed taller, there were slightly more nuts on.
Oh.
Oh, I unmuted you, I think.
All right,
I think you've been muted too. Sorry. Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, so first of all, I wanted to say I believe we also have Tom Wall with us, who is a wealth of knowledge about chestnuts and tree crops in general. So if anyone has any questions for him as well, I would say maybe take the opportunity. But he's also going to be doing one of these nutshells in a couple months or so.
That's right. He's doing the very next nutshell, which is February 13th, in fact.
Michael Gold is also with us, I believe, from the University of Missouri Center for Agroforestry, and he is also a wealth of knowledge on chestnuts. So
All
have
right.
a good crowd.
But yeah, to answer your question, Christy, I don't actually have any grafted cultivars on my place as of now. I probably will be top working some, and that's something I didn't mention is that kind of anecdotally, a lot of people have mentioned that they have a lot more success with grafts when they're top working established trees rather than younger nursery stock. So I will be doing that in the future, but the ones that you saw that were producing early and more vigorous, it was just kind of a due to genetic chance.
Oh. So go ahead. Anybody else can jump in and ask a question. Again, if you're on the phone, it's *6, or hit us up in the chat function, or cue your question in the app. Oh, here we have Michael Gold. All right, Michael. I think you should be able to talk now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, it was more of a comment. Christy, I picked up your message midway through this presentation, so I missed the beginning part. But I really wanted to mention to folks if they're very interested in following up on chestnuts, it's worth attending a Chestnut Growers of America meeting, because that's where you get to talk to dozens of people from all over the country who have a lot of knowledge, and people will share very freely at those meetings. So it's worth attending.
Oh, great. When is that again?
Tom knows. I'm not 100% sure. They're usually around, I'm going to guess, the 10th of June. This year, I think it's going to be back out on the West Coast. We tend to rotate between the eastern half of the U.S. and then hop back to the West Coast on alternating years. But I can't remember who's hosting this year. But if you go to the Chestnut Growers of America website, eventually it'll be posted if it's not there already.
Great, thank you so much. That's a great reminder.
Yeah, thanks for that suggestion. I was actually going to mention them as well as the Northern Nut Growers Association is a great group for kind of nuts in general, but there are a number of chestnut people in there. But yeah, the Chestnut Growers of America is a great, really specific group just for chestnuts.
Thanks, Kate and Matt. If you're following on online in the chat function, there's a website link, and it looks like June 1st through 3rd in Gridley, California. That's where it is this year.
I should also mention too, there is a Facebook group called All About Chestnuts, I believe, and that's been an excellent group to take part in. There's some quite a wide variety of people in there, both kind of commercial and hobby growers, as well as just a lot of kind of new people looking for advice. So that's a good group if you use Facebook.
We have a second about All About Chestnuts.
All right. Oh, it's Emily. Hi, Emily.
All right, we have somebody from the phone. Hi, go ahead.
This is Tom Wall. I guess I don't have a question, but I have another comment regarding the Japanese-European hybrid chestnut. Casey mentioned that he thought the internal kernel breakdown or nut rot could be caused by Chinese chestnut pollen. but they also have that same problem in places like New Zealand and Australia where they don't grow Chinese chestnuts. And they have just as bad a problem with internal kernel breakdown with the Japanese European hybrids there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I have heard that as well. And yeah, I think like a lot of things with chestnuts, there's just a lot of unanswered questions that there's an easy explanation for them, but then kind of when you dig into it, it doesn't become quite as easy.
Casey, Matt here. I had a quick question about your strategy of using kind of rows of specific seedlings. You had a row of Gideon and a row of Ching. I think it's a really neat idea. And then if they don't pan out to be good, you can graft onto them. My question is, at what point do you make that decision, and how old can you graft chestnuts? How old can you top work them?
Yeah, that's great questions. I don't really know. That's one of the things I kind of struggle with is there's some trees that I've already thought like, I don't think that's going to be a good tree, but you always have that a little voice in your head that says like, well, give it another year or so, and maybe it's going to get better. Maybe it needs this, maybe it needs that. So, obviously, if it's being damaged by cold, I've culled a number of seedlings just because they've died to the ground every winter. So those you can't graft on top of, unfortunately. But yeah, that's a question that I have as well. I'm not really quite to the point where I have to worry about it a lot yet. But for those of you that aren't on the computer, see the chat. Mike Gold, he's mentioned with the top working that you can do it at any age, and that in Europe they do large trees, large stumps that he saw in Portugal in 2004. And yeah, I think probably the bigger the tree, the more you want to do individual limbs. But yeah, for the most part, I think you can do them at quite an old age.
And Kate McFarland had a question. Do you have a process or timeline that you would recommend for people making decisions about planting chestnuts on their farm? You mentioned a few planting strategies, but are there earlier steps or other approaches to consider?
Well, I think, one thing I didn't get into at all is just how to plant chestnuts and how to care for them. And I think that is also a big thing besides the genetics. A lot of people think like, oh, okay, I can plant chestnuts and I get 2,000 pounds per acre. That's great. But that figure, and you can get quite a bit more than that depending on the orchard, but that, often quoted 2,000 pounds per acre, that's for trees that are cared for well and have competition limited. So I think those are important things too, besides the genetics, just the general orchard care. And, really the first thing you need to find out is, do you have good soil for growing chestnuts? You want an acidic soil that's between 6.5 to 5.5, and it's easier to go lower on that than to go higher on the pH spectrum. And then also more well-drained soils rather than like a heavy clay soil. So yeah, those are things to consider. Another thing is the University of Missouri, which Mike Gold is with. They have a lot of great resources, and they're going to be included in the follow-up email, some links for them, and they have a chestnut budgeting tool. It's basically like an enterprise budget looking at costs and when you will start to have payback to offset those costs and when you get to the break-even point and all that kind of stuff.
Casey? Kate says thanks too.
Oh, great. You're welcome.
Tree tubes.
Tree tubes, yeah. I like tree tubes. Not everyone uses them. I think partially the more deer pressure you have, the more you need to use tree tubes. You can do fencing for deer. It's cheaper to use tree tubes. The thing that's nice about fencing is that you know, people often think about the establishment phase of getting the tree above browse height, but also once the trees are producing, you can lose a lot of nuts to deer. So, so I personally use tree tubes. Not everyone does. It's going to depend on your specific circumstances. And, another benefit of tree tubes is it will start the first scaffold limbs at 5 foot if you have a 5-foot tree tube. So I like that as well.
Well, if there's no more questions for Casey, I want to take the opportunity again to say thank you to everybody for coming and being with us for the last hour or so and hearing from Casey. And thank you so much, Casey, for sharing all your knowledge again. And thank you for people jumping in and commenting and asking questions.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Casey.